Welcome everybody to the OnGo Alliance OnGo Neutral Host webinar. Happy that you could spend some time with us today. Let's get straight into it, Stephanie. Just some housekeeping, the usual general notices. By joining the webinar, you agree to the terms that were in the invite. The session is being recorded and you will receive afterwards a link to the recording. And if you have any questions, just go to the questions/chat in GoToMeeting and submit them. We will have someone in the background looking at them in real time, but we'll also have a lot of time at the end for Q&A, hopefully. So we should be good there as well. Next slide. So just intro of the speakers today. We have Yosef Abdullaila from, he is from American Tower, and he is a board member of the OnGo Alliance, and more important in this context, he's also a chair of the co-chair together with Joel in the business working group. We have Joel Lindholm from Facebook, another chair of the business working group, and both of these people have been basically almost from inception in the OnGo Alliance and have been working honestly for the last couple of years to get this OnGo Neutral Host off the ground. And everything you'll be seeing today basically is kind of the fruits of the Alliance kind of working group efforts. And myself, I'm Oren Binder. I'm the marketing director of the OnGo Alliance. Just before we go to the next slide, I just want to introduce the concept of OnGo because there are some questions around it. We are called today the OnGo Alliance. We have expanded. We used to be the CBRS Alliance. And OnGo is basically a brand that the Alliance adopted to reflect the work that's being done by our members on shared spectrum. We expanded our scope beyond CBRS to other bands as well, but it's really, in this context, it would be reflecting the work being done by the members around different solutions around shared spectrum. So OnGo Neutral Host is basically, in this context, a neutral host solution on the CBRS network, put together by the OnGo Alliance. Next slide. So what we're here to talk about today is basically the indoor cellular coverage challenge. We know, and people on this call, I'm sure, are familiar with the dead spots when you're inside buildings. So if we talk for a second about the property side, obviously, if you have bad indoor cellular coverage, you have poor quality of experience, complaints from employees, you know that salespeople want to be online all the time, customer satisfaction, property value, tenants. So again, it really is something that affects across the board the quality of experience of people in the property. And if we look at the solutions today, they mostly target, and I'm talking here honestly about DAS, the larger properties, which would require a more complex and expensive solution. So that's really what the properties are dealing with today. And if we look at that on the operator side, it's really in a lot of cases not their fault that there is bad indoor coverage and there are dead spots. The building could either be very old or actually very new and have lead insulation, which bounces the macro off. And that means that even if there's a tower half a mile away from the building, they won't necessarily have good indoor coverage. And this also means that subscribers, if you're thinking of people from a tier 1 operator walking into a hotel, they're not getting coverage, and this basically affects their customers as well that are getting bad service inside these buildings. Not to mention the fact that they've obviously made huge spectrum investments around 5G and others to increase their coverage nationwide, but again, this means they have less money for CapEx to basically invest in addressing the solution. And I'd like to bring now actually both Joel and Yusuf. And Joel, I know, again, you've been talking to customers endlessly and have a lot of experience, again, with this pain point exactly. So just be great to hear from you a little bit more on this.
Yeah, thanks, Oren. Yeah, from a historical perspective, this is a pain point that's been growing for the last several years as people are more and more dependent on their smartphone and the needs for not only voice, but now also the need for data and throughput At the same time, we have this emergence of the real estate properties becoming more and more environmentally efficient. It's just heading in the wrong direction, and the industry's never had a good solution that's scalable. When you look at the traditional models, and like Oren said, it's right, not the mobile operator's fault. The technology implementations require the mobile operators that have their macro networks, and if you're bringing that signal inside the building, it adds complications and coordination between the mobile operators and the venue itself, which is time, expense, coordination, and just a difficult approach to implement. And what's new here is the fact that we have something, and we'll introduce it shortly, of a tool that makes that more friendly. We're thinking that this is an opportunity for lots of different properties of different types to have. So you can think hospitals or hotels or just general office buildings. A lot of places that may not have been able to justify that effort before now have the ability to bring a solution and solve that in-building cellular coverage problem. And so if it's done right, then we think that there is a way that this could solve a pain point both from the venue perspective as well as from an operator perspective. Joseph, anything to add?
Thank you. So I'd just like to add this orange highlighted below. The TAM is big, and I think it's an opportunity. And from the OnGo perspective, finally we have a solution thanks to the spectrum. To Joel's points, there are existing technology, but the penetration in the market was limited. First of all, because of cost and the length it takes to deploy. When it's deployed, people enjoy that seamless connectivity from outside in. But right now, for the first time in history, we have this spectrum, which we call the innovation spectrum, which is enabling us to deploy OnGo Neutral Host, whether private or neutral host. It's just simpler to deploy, and it's faster to go on air. In other words, to deploy takes, like, I'm talking about months. This is taking, typically current solution 12 to 18 months to deploy. It's just the nature of that solution. But more importantly, a lot of the buildings today, especially mid-tier, cannot afford the existing solution. And also they have lid class, and then typically the strategy of the MNO is leverage as much as macro, but that RF signal doesn't penetrate. And now, the first time in history, having the availability of shared spectrum can enable you to deploy it at lower economics and really take advantage of cellular connectivity in your building. That a lot of these vertical were basically impacting the business, either customer churn or tenants, not having connectivity. So you could see the impact, and this is the first time, as I said, in history where we have ability to deploy cellular connectivity for in-building.
Yeah, and let's get straight into that. Next slide. Talk about basically how CBRS is basically, let's introduce CBRS. So I know that basically almost everybody on this call is very familiar with CBRS. I'm not going to get into too much of how it works, but I think just to hit the high notes here, it is called the Innovation Band, and the idea was from the FCC to drive innovation. I think we're already seeing that in the market today, but we're going to see a lot more of it in the very near future. 150 megahertz of mid-band spectrum, which is obviously very invaluable for talking about 5G, and in general in building, I think it lends itself very well to in-building coverage. And when we say widely available, it's the fact that basically anybody that puts an access point can access at least part of the spectrum. The general access part is 80 megahertz, and so again, we're looking at a ton of spectrum available for in-building for different initiatives. The allocation of the spectrum is done automated by a SAS system. That's working well, and we've been seeing this in action basically since January 2020, when this has been made commercially available. And what we're seeing today, again, the different deployments of CBRS have been private networks, which would be, let's say, a factory putting together an internal closed network for its own mission critical, business critical, mostly use cases there. We're seeing a lot of fixed wireless deployments, residential broadband to bring residential broadband and others. And in this case, I think COVID really highlighted how they could bring into houses to get students connected in their houses with broadband. That's something that really blew up in the last year and a half. with the unfortunate circumstances, but something positive came out of it. Also, MNO capacity. I mean, we're seeing the operators basically augment their own capacity with this high quality spectrum that's out there. So to use this basically to augment their own coverage. So in addition to all these, we're also now, I think, kind of the next frontier of where CBRS will be used will be with neutral host. And just to give a taste of where we are today, and I know this number kind of surprises a lot of people, but again, we've only been commercial for about a year and a half, a little bit more, and we already have 180,000 CBRS CBSDs. Those are the endpoints and small cells deployed today in the field. And like I said, we're just getting started with CBRS.
And one thing to add, just to embellish it a little bit, is the automation of the SAS, that spectrum access system. When I was talking earlier about some of the complexities that stand in the way of deploying the traditional models where the mobile operator owns their licensed bands, in practical terms, when you bring that inside of a building, somebody has to do kind of an elaborate design to make sure that there's no interference between this network that we're putting inside the building and the networks that are outside the building. And that's a fairly complicated process there. The automation that the SAS brings removes those barriers, because the SAS their job is literally looking across the country and where the spectrum is actually used. So their job is to make sure that this interference is mitigated, and automates it so that you can actually add a radio, and in nearly real time, you can get a grant of spectrum from that SAS that enables you to go use it. And it bypasses a number of the headaches that stand in the way of operationalizing networks like this. It's a great tool. It's something that OnGo has worked for years with the Department of Defense that owns the spectrum, as the Navy specifically, and the FCC. But it's a very key tool that's giving us this ability here. Maybe on the next slide, transition.
So now really the question, the question is how these two combine to each other. We're talking about neutral hosts, we're talking about CBRS, so really how they come together and why does this make so much sense?
Yeah, I think a lot of the industry has been using the to date. So I think Oren mentioned, right, fixed wireless access, or the MNOs using it for capacity. I think there's a ton of energy on these private networks, which are really meant for kind of independent networks that aren't tied to a public network. And a lot of the use cases are around sort of IoT-like devices, cameras and push-to-talk phones and robots and things like that in a private network. In this case, what we're referring to here is something that's more of a public-facing network. And so there obviously needs to be some sort of an entity that brings that network to the property owners, that sits in between the venue and the mobile operator, the networks of the two. And so this entity would be a neutral host operator, and they would be kind of the liaison, if you will, between each of the different operators that are participating. Those operators could be the tier 1 mobile operators, I think the big three. It could be MVNOs, it could be cable operators, it could be anybody that is an operator per se, that is connected by this network that is resident inside of the venue's property. And so there's a number of people that have been doing this in the past with some of the legacy technologies. They may be entrants in the market here. It may be other people, but the key piece of it is that somebody is going to be able to do that coordination and not leave it up to each venue themselves to go and have to deal with each operator themselves, and vice versa as well. So that's the entity that would sit in the middle here and operate that network.
I'd like to add something. So from this illustration, what Joel is saying, that's one way to do it, but anybody could be a neutral host, operator, an MNO or a carrier can be a neutral host. However, if you're dealing with thousands of building, one of the things, the value proposition here from the neutral host operator is to minimize the interaction, having to keep up with thousands of building and 1,000 customer. And so there's just one scenario that we're describing here, where you have a neutral host operator provider where they bring in the relationship with the carrier and then a relationship with the enterprise, and deploy a neutral host solution. And then there's a lot of work that needs to be done beside just the technology. Of course, now we have the OnGo Neutral Host solution, which makes it really easy and economical to deploy and faster. But also there is the KPI, SLAs, and all the contract and what have you. So there's a whole process workflow, and a lot of these neutral host operator providers tend to facilitate that and make things easy. But again, one thing to take away is that, which we'll highlight later in the framework, is that there are three entities. You have the carriers or the MSO, what have you, and also they have the enterprise, and you have the 3PO, the neutral host operator. And so you can have multiple variation when deploying neutral host, depending on the business case and the business model. I just want to add that clarification.
Yeah, I think we're ready to get into really now how CBRS comes into the picture here with Joel. Next slide. You're muted, Joel.
So this is a unique situation, as I think we talked about a little bit here, right? We have this mid-band spectrum, which the nice thing about it is it offers a good amount of capacity. So when you're making a voice call, you don't need as much wireless capacity, but when you're doing video and other types of communications, it's better to have that kind of mid-band capacity. And being that, as we were talking about earlier, that the coordination is limited between to remove interference and with the macro networks, and that automation helps significantly to be able to bring this to as a viable solution to almost any building. We had mentioned 97 billion square feet of commercial real estate in the United States. Now that is a whole variety of different sizes. That stadiums on down to very small, very small office buildings or retail stores and whatnot. And so it could be used there, and it could be used in residential neighborhoods, but in buildings. But there'll probably be some sort of a sweet spot as to where the different tools that are available. Like in a large venue, it might be a part of a tool instead of a whole tool. In other buildings, it might be the proper tool, but it gives us the right kind of spectrum to use for a variety of different buildings, and really opens up that, exposes that unserved part of the commercial real estate world. Band 48 is specifically what we need to look for. When we started this years ago in OnGo, we needed to get band 48 in devices, whether it be for the private networks or whether it be for neutral host. But the last couple years worth of flagship phones from all the primary handset manufacturers have been supporting this. So the device penetration is actually pretty high at this point. In which case, I think just people need to look for band 48 on their devices, and it shouldn't be an issue. I've talked a little bit about the simplification of deployment. That the small cell type deployment makes life easier because there's some just flexibility in figuring deploying kind of more like a Wi-Fi like model, rather than bringing in equipment that's more been dedicated to a macro network type deployment. The products that are available on the market today can fit more into that enterprise IT type deployment models and those types of processes. I've talked about the spectrum planning. One of the interesting things is, even though you might see a signal in a building, it may not mean that you get capacity in a building. And because you may get some good antenna performance, but the capacity on the macro networks is something that the operators have to, the primary spectrum owners that are providing those macro networks have to take into consideration. if they don't have to be serving with their own spectrum inside the building, that actually offloads the spectrum for them to use in other parts of their networks and helps out. And if you think about a broader scale of deployment, it's not just a single building, but at a I'll call it macro level, it does help that significantly. And once you remove all those barriers, it does become just a more cost-effective way of deploying a network inside of a building here. I don't know if others don't want to add anything there.
Yeah, I like to say, thank you, Joel. I like to see what excites me is this availability ecosystem. As you can see on the bottom right in the slide, even some of these phones went into generation. You could see that you went from a generation, they adopted this way early, which is exciting because for us that started this way back, as Joel hinted to, is that you were doing not a whole lot of ecosystem device to even try to network, but now it's really exciting. And even myself, when I got one of these phones that have band 48 if you're doing 4G or N48 if you're doing 5G, that would be the spectrum band you look into in the device. Is exciting. And one more thing is a lot of these devices come with dual SIM, which makes it really also enable you to basically have the phone that can connect to a private LTE if an institution decides to provide that to their employee or staff. I use it for facility management or smart building, and then you still take advantage of neutral host because that will be to the user, will be just a seamless connectivity, and that's exciting to see that. And there are many devices, if you go to the website, beyond the handset, there are laptops, there are tablet, there are IoT gateways that are natively communicate on this band, on the CBRS band. And this, as I said, is quite exciting now that, I cannot wait to do one at home, because when I do conferences like this, I always struggle with the connectivity. So I would love to have that CBRS where we can just take it out of the box and you just work.
And I think there's one last thing to add there. The devices, a lot of us, so you might get your device directly from Google or Apple or somebody like that. But the majority of devices are also procured through the mobile operators. So the interesting thing is their skin in the game from the actual device manufacturers themselves and commitment, from the chips to the handsets and supporting this for multiple generations so far. It also implies that as these networks come into buildings, that there's a collaboration opportunity between mobile operators and the device manufacturers and the networks that they're deploying. If done properly, that whole ecosystem can benefit and be done seamlessly. And the fact that it's a 3GPP standard band makes it good, because it's something that's endorsed, if you will, by the larger cellular community. Okay, next slide. Joseph?
Yeah, thank you. So what the business working group is, we, Oren mentioned earlier, we were really working with the members collectively, and we have a really diverse members, including the carriers, MSO, what have you, and also some of the enterprise. We decided to say, okay, just for educational purposes, people don't know anything about neutral host, or if they know, they just have the classical definition. So we created a framework. Is early illustration that Joel highlighted in the earlier slide. There are three entities, right? You have basically a venue owner and an operator, and then you have a neutral host operator, and typically you can have different variation. If we look at the scenario where I talked about earlier, you could have a neutral operator bring the relationship with the venue owner and also the carrier to facilitate, make at least the business relationship easy. And now with OnGo Neutral Host, one of the things that we look at is that the spectrum, right? And because of the availability of spectrum, you look at the building and you try to identify, do you need license, share, or unlicensed? So now you have another tool in your toolbox to deploy, a cellular connectivity for wide use and, more importantly, for neutral host. So some of the elements in that framework, so we can have common language as people started deploying this in the market, is, as I said, first you start with the spectrum, and then you try to understand the use case. It's all about that workflow that a neutral host operator tried to understand, and then you need to capture the KPI both from the operator perspective and also from the owner perspective, because the owner most likely you want to basically solve a business problem that they have. And then, how does OnGo can map to that, and technology can help them solve that. And also, we need to capture the value for both of the operator as well as the owner, because the different building, you want to make sure that the value proposition is met. And ultimately, you want to make sure that that solution end to end is easily, deployed. As I said, is faster to deploy, and economics capture the ROI from not only the operator perspective, but also from the venue perspective, because that ROI with the total cost of ownership actually drive the right business model, which I'll talk about later. And the business model here, that's what for the first time I think with the OnGo Neutral Host has, is Joel highlighted earlier, is becoming like IT-like deployment. It's almost like you would deploy at Wi-Fi economics, and is easy to deploy. In fact, depends if you have brownfield or greenfield, you can leverage your IT infrastructure, and that's some of the beauty of this OnGo Neutral Host solution. And as I said before, now for the first time, it's enable us to offer flexible business model, because it depends on the vertical. People may have different budget, and like I said before, you couldn't afford the current solution deployed in the market that predominantly happen to be licensed, whether it's DAS or small cell. But now they have the opportunity to deploy neutral host and leverage the same customer experience that's seamless when people come in the building while they're on their phone. They can seamlessly, with the OnGo Neutral Host technology, stay connected while they go inside the building.
I think one thing to add, though, Yosef. So there's a number of different facets of this model, that the framework that Yosef talked about. This is like just one thing I'll just somewhat caution, right, is that this is something new, right, for the operators to go and accept some other third-party kind of network, if you will. So being they don't license and own that spectrum, this is a neutral spectrum. But the entity that is delivering on this framework needs to be able to deliver to those requirements. There's still a number of kind of regulatory obligations. There's quality of experience obligations. This is still a mobile network, not a Wi-Fi network, and nothing against Wi-Fi networks, but some of the implications on the implementation as well as on the regulatory front are different when it comes to this mobile network. And so there's a lot of criteria that's under the covers of what Yosef was explaining here. And as this model emerges and as people start delivering on this model, there's going to be, not to take it lightly, the operator's perspective, because again, it's going to be their subscribers and the venue ownership. So quality of experience, it's a critical piece of this, but also the other obligations that come along with this being a mobile network.
That was a good point, Joel. Absolutely. Thank you for adding the clarification. Hence, that's why you see the element that we talk about, value proposition, has to be really well captured. It is about capturing the value. And again, there's more details, and there's like, for example, Diplomat Working Group, will highlight how do you deploy this. But for us, from the business perspective, business working group, we're looking at the business case and the business model and how we capture the value. And ultimately, you want to make sure we bring awareness of this new technology to all the parties involved. And Joel said something really subtle here. And the nice thing about the OnGo Neutral Host is that today, the owner can go and deploy that network, leveraging their allocated budget and use it for their own facility and take advantage already. And then, to the relationship with for example, the scenario that we were describing here, to a neutral host operator, then you can start thinking about how do I bring in that neutral host, that seamless connectivity, and hence to Joel's point is that's where that middle person comes in, brings a lot of value, because they have the experience, even the technology, the LTE technology is somewhat, needs a lot of experience, and a lot of the IT folks that typically Wi-Fi have to develop that, but typically a lot of these neutral host operator bring that experience, which is critical, but also they have, some legacy relationship or working relationship with the operators, so they have understanding of some of the requirements, which is really critical have this end-to-end solution. And again, the goal of this framework is for us to create a common language as we move forward and deploy this, and hopefully we scale this everywhere, is that we make it easy on everybody, that they understand not only from pre-sale, but from post-sale all the way to when you deploy the network. Next slide.
Yeah, so maybe let's get into the next slide, into the business models, and I'll just say, Yusuf, we have quite a few questions around it. So once you finish here, I'll pepper you guys with the questions. So, none of them will be surprising, but yeah.
Absolutely. So this is just an example that we're quite excited. Like I mentioned before into the framework and earlier. I mean, this is for the first time. First of all, having the band. I mean, that's a gift, right? I mean, GAA it's free to everybody. They play small license to have the SaaS, but that's minimal. To me, is having your own HUV lane that really clean, that you can deploy today, and that's leveraging LTE technology is quite powerful. And then of course you have the PAL, which is a licensed portion of it. But for most of the in-building, PAL may not be necessary, but for the outdoor, you may need PAL. So we did some analysis and to third party, and we discover, and this snapshot is from a white paper you can find on the website, where it shows that studies have shown that the economics is 68% much lower than the DAS. And you can see, even compared to Wi-Fi, it's very, very close. And this is if you do it independently. Now, you can imagine when you have existing Wi-Fi solution already, you can leverage the same infrastructure, and they're going to reduce the cost even further. And that's one of the attractiveness. Now that you have the total cost of ownership that is really attractive, you can imagine the impact on the business model, because everything has to be driven. Can we do this, cheaper, faster, better? And finally, we believe that the OnGo Neutral Host fit in perfectly in that wedge between what people have been enjoying with Wi-Fi and people have been enjoying with DAS, and they offer out a benefit, which basically insights of the data. So that leads us to this business model. And in the white paper, we highlighted more detail on this flexibility. And the market will adopt, variety of these. So if we talk about neutral host as a service, for example, we can have a 3PO, third party deploy that, where they can basically, own all the equipment, and the enterprise could just subscribe. And then this would be most of them enterprise funded model, which previously the DAS used to be carrier funded model. Well, right now, if you look at most of the carrier, a lot of the investment they made in spectrum, and now this would also enable them to capture the ROI and said, okay, if they are building that have basically the OnGo Neutral Host, maybe I can just come in and easily working through the neutral host operator and be able to provide that customer experience that you can provide into the subscriber. And then of course there's also another, as I said, another model that could be had is the venue own. If the venue have, some of the venue are developing expertise, or they have in this technology, and they can basically own invest capex and also capex, and own and manage end to end. As I mentioned earlier, there are some big large venue where they have the expertise and they even own some license. I mean, if you look at some of the hockey areas, they've been deploying LTE in the camera, so there's no reason for them not to directly be neutral host, as mentioned. So that's another scenario. And then there's always hybrid model, which you could have combination of co-ownership with that network between the neutral host operator or the venue. Ultimately here, the takeaway is the ongoing economics are very compelling. There are like Wi-Fi economics, they're easy to deploy. Like I said, within months we're talking about, you can deploy the network, which is fantastic. And then with neutral host OnGo, depending on the business model and the ROI, then you can really benefit from having that seamless connectivity that we've been enjoying this past year with the classical technology deployed.
That's good. I think there's a question. I'll kind of try and answer a little bit of it here too. It's interesting when you have a mobile operator and traditional delivery models from operators through the 3POs and the other types of integrators, if you will. Then there's an enterprise kind of view of how they've been consuming things like Wi-Fi, and so there's a kind of a blend happening, I think, from an industry will happen, I should say, from an industry perspective on how the different business models will tend to align. Like as Joseph said, right, there's a few different. Is it all venue owned? Is it somebody else funded? Is it a hybrid model? Those will all emerge over time, and some of those may be venue specific, depending on the type. I mean, we're talking about a large range from stadiums and airports and big, large venues with thousands of people to smaller properties that have very few people. So it'll probably have a full range, but the key message is that this should be beneficial to them. One of the questions online was regarding the is OnGo Alliance going to be looking to be a clearinghouse, and how does a neutral host operator get into this market? So this is an emerging segment in that the operators are digesting this in terms of their particular business models and how they want to see things go forward. They'll have a pretty big say in. As a industry person here for a number of years, they're probably not going to want to just open it up to everybody until things start to grow, and it'll eventually emerge differently over time, simply because it is a mobile network, it is their subscribers, and it does come with legal obligations. So I think that's a very mobile operator dependent conversation to have if you're somebody that's interested in emerging into this space.
Yeah, I can add to that question, which I mean, how did a neutral host operator get an agreement? And I mean, we see this as it could be an extension for people that have the relationship. This would be, like I said, just another toolbox. For newcomers, I mean, the hope for us is to create enough collateral to educate them. There are folks that we have a lot of guides and on site that can help enable folks with the to get started. Would the Alliance take the role of, I think it was asked here, a clearinghouse? They are actually members that are, part of the business strategy. They want to become that. So from us, that's a good point. I don't know the answer to that. It's something we can tackle from the Alliance perspective. But for us as a whole, we enable folks like that. And as I said, there are multiple folks that are using, they are becoming a clearinghouse. Some are very well known already. They've been doing that on Wi-Fi, so this is an extension to them. And as I said, to Joel's point, the market gonna select which business model and ultimately the adoption of this technology. And each carrier can have their own strategy. So we can have to speak what their strategy is. But one thing that is exciting is that even to review the paper, they were quite involved, give us really good positive feedback overall from this new technology. And we have diverse membership, so which include the carriers, include the OEMs, as well as the neutral host operators. So a lot of the input and feedback comes from them by the interaction from all the parties, including the enterprise. And again, takeaway here from the business model, we have flexibility that we didn't have before, which is really exciting, and that's the key. And the economics are, the TCR is very, very attractive. So
cool. Do you want to hit the next slide? Or do you have
maybe before we get to that though, just and I don't want to get too technical here, but there are questions of how the handoff works. So just talk about the different options here that would be on a handoff from. Obviously, you'd have to go from the operator, the customer, to CBRS. So just maybe touch that, and obviously we could point people to the deployment guide. I don't know who wants to take that.
I'll try and break it down to some extent. There's a number of different technical implementations for doing this. So I guess the easiest way to think about it is, you've got a mobile phone that's some subscriber. They have a SIM that's in the device. There's some radio that's going to be in the venue itself, and then there's some sort of a network connection back to the mobile operators. So those are kind of the big pieces that exist. And I think one of the objective is that, so when somebody's able to walk in the venue, and whether they're on the macro network, and then they see this network inside the building, that their phone is able to gracefully connect to that building or with the network that's in that building, and have the back-end relationship somehow for that to connect to the mobile operator. There's a number of implementations that people are looking at for how that actually happens on the back end. From a venue owner perspective, it should simply be a criteria, I think, of I have a network in the building that I've deployed, and it should be able to deliver the mobile service to whoever, if it's a tenant of the building, if it's a guest of the building, or whatever it might be. So that's that perspective. On the back end, that is I think where one of the models will emerge from these neutral host operators to the primary carrier. There's things there's technical implementations that have been done in the past, and it becomes a kind of a combination of technical implementation plus business to business relationship between that neutral host operator and the primary mobile operator. There's some of the deployment. Let me maybe I guide it to the deployment guide as to some of the actual technical implementations of how that can be done. It gets into a lot of nuances and a lot of details, which is kind of why I'm not going into that now, because it in itself is probably an hour-long webinar to discuss those nuances.
Yeah, just to sum up what Joel nicely said, deployment guide really give you a lot of detail how to stand the network and deploy it, including SIM management, what have you. How do you do that? Which is great. That's a compliment to what we're doing here, because we're focusing on the business side of things. But just to add, to simplify, add clarity to what Joel's saying, it will be just like a typical network today. If you go to a large venue, they have DAS typically. If you go to a stadium, what have you, you don't really, from the customer perspective, it's seamless, right? So typically, there's a technical term called MORAN, but in here, the OnGo Neutral Host and in the white paper, we cover from high level different options you have, and one of them is called MOCN, which is a multi-operator, for a network that people, the technology and the architecture will enable the MNO to really easily plug in. And there's a lot of under the hood works and be done, and the deployment has covered a lot of that. And so, as I said, this network will make it really just like you had a network from the user perspective, will be the seamless connectivity, and that's the takeaway from the OnGo Neutral Host.
And maybe a small question here, just because I saw it came in, but I think it'll clarify. You alluded to it before, Yusuf, but would you need a separate kind of SIM card for each network here? And I think that kind of goes to the difference between private networks and neutral hosts, maybe.
Yeah, so for the in terms of the neutral host, no, because typically when you do MOCN architecture, deployment cover that is a MOCN gateway. Just to give you the analogy, like basically the user doesn't do anything seamless, and that's not what you want, right? So the carrier takes care of all that, and they'll be able to broadcast their own PLM ID. So for the user, if let's say I'm going outside of the building, it's seamless. It's the whole idea of part of the experience. I don't have to fiddle with anything at all. In terms of the private network, I mean, the enterprise, it depends if they hire, they have let's say the neutral host operator, they will manage the SIM for the user. If they have, for example, if you have an enterprise that provides phones to their facility managers or the staff, they'll be already pre-configured and have the SIM to the private network. Okay, and now with the dual SIM, as I hinted before, there's an easy way to do it, where basically to QR, let's say, for example, you go to a large venue or casino where you want to provide that network exclusively to the high rollers to enhance the experience. You could say, hey, look, I have this private network you can get into. And there are easy way to do it with dual SIMs phones getting penetration in the US. You can give a QR in the back of the ticket, scan that, and there's a lot of folks working on software to automate that. I mean, that's what I have today personally in my phone, and that's what I was able to do. So that's some of the newest, things I could say about that.
And there's the one that we didn't mention is roaming, and and that's kind of where, so like the implementations that where Yusuf was adding some clarity, right, is depending on the implementation of the technology, it has an impact on the SIM that's in the device, how the radio is transmitting the signals for that SIM to recognize and connect to eventually a core on the back end. And so there are a few different options. He mentioned Makin, the multi-operator core network approach, has one implementation to it, but the overall objective, I think, should be that it's a seamless experience from a user perspective. If I'm the mobile phone user and I'm walking into a building, and if I have to go and do something different to my mobile phone, then I may or may not do that. That's one of the things that plagues the Wi-Fi world today, in that you have to go and authenticate onto a network, and that has one set of business implications to it. If there's fees on the back end, that has other implications to it, and so it will become a very venue-to-venue kind of selection, and I think the market will eventually play out with what is the best business model, the best technical implementation for the proper venue. And this is emerging, and the operators need to digest that, and they will obviously have a perspective, being that they own the relationship with me as a subscriber, and then what's going to deliver the network service there. There's a question, I think, that on the graphic that's on the slide here, and that's a graphic that was looking at there's a Mobile Experts report that had done this analysis, and it was looking at, I think, a lot of the infrastructure components to it, and some estimates that come from what was able to be gathered in the industry. When we went through that in collaboration with Mobile Experts, it was we tried to normalize it in that the cost of equipment, the cost of an EPC, the cost of whatever the SIM is, and the deployment is, and what the Wi-Fi is, and so we normalized a number of those things. As we start emerging forward with these different business models, obviously those numbers will change. Some may be more CapEx friendly or heavy, and vice versa on OpEx, or it might just be purely OpEx. And it'll also become somewhat neutral host operator dependent. The point is that we've been able to take the implementations and the business models to take a lot of the extra cost out of the system, to normalize it away from kind of the pain that's been associated with DAS or individual mobile operator small cells, to something that is a shared network of small cells that is much more on par with what a Wi-Fi type model is.
Just to add to what Joel said, yeah, that paper is on Mobile Experts is on a website. The question was 600K. We didn't do the 600K, but it's easily, you can extrapolate based on what we've done here. What the analyst has done, he really took a 200 square feet, because that happened to be in the sweet spot with the mid-tier, which basically you have no cellular connectivity today. So that was the example that was given part of the requirements, and did the really analysis. I don't know the number on top of my head, part square footage, what's the cost, but it's in there in that paper. It did really a nice study, and highlighted the square footage and the top segment, and even there's a detailed study. It shows different kind of deployments, right? Carrier class deployment, for example, and to Joel's point, depends on the equipment you use, right? And that has an impact on the entire total cost of ownership. But the first square footage is in that white paper as well.
And you have to look at, I think, if the question's coming from a venue owner, what are the costs of designing the network, and is it something that requires a lot of coordination with each mobile operator, or is it something that can be done more independently? What is the cost of actually designing the network and installing the network, and how applicable is it to your particular venue? What does it take to get the connectivity back to the neutral host operator from backhaul perspectives? And then obviously there's the equipment costs and the operational costs that are associated with it, and the time frame in order to get the networks up and going. A lot of those come into a consideration when you're looking at a true total cost of ownership. And what the needs are for your particular venue and what timelines. DAS typically takes, with the licensed bands on it, it could take a year, and it's a very selective process because it is an expense for the mobile operator to bring their signal sources to the venue and operationalize it on their side. So they have to go through a business justification to say how many subscribers are there, and you have to have that with each of the different mobile operators. And if we can remove a lot of that pain in negotiation, part of the savings is on the actual infrastructure costs, but part of it is simply on all the logistics and management and coordination that is involved with people outside of your actual venue yourself.
Yeah, and I just want to touch one thing so we don't ignore Dean here with the fair question. Are there any existing working neutral host sites today running CBRS with operators? And I think that beyond trials and what we're here is we're presenting basically a concept that's ready to be deployed. And so, yeah, I don't know if Joel or Yusuf, you want to touch that one, but I think that is something important to just mention.
Yeah, I mean, I think all I can say is that I think the mobile operators are certainly aware of this model, and generally, I think they're more open to seeing that this is something that could be deployed. And unfortunately, I can't say a whole lot more about it, but in the past, a year ago, 2 years ago, it might have been a more allergic reaction. But I think the pain point is so recognized. I mean, practically speaking, right? They have to spend money on their 5G networks and upgrading. There's a whole race to that. All the C-band that they bought, and there's a whole lot of money and expense, and they do recognize that the pain point of in-building is getting worse. And when you truly do look after the quality of experience of, in their case, their subscribers, the better that in buildings can be served, as long as it does protect their business models, then why would you not do this? And so I think the mindset has certainly shifted. But I think any of the trials and POCs or any other other types of deployments are probably still pretty well protected under NDAs, and I doubt you'll get many people to talk about it publicly.
Yeah, let's maybe get into the next slide, and we could cover a little bit about the members and how they fit in, because we're getting some questions about that as well. So really, at a high level, we touch the OnGo Alliance. So right now we have 196 members. What you're seeing here, the logos here, are the board members: American Tower, Boingo, CommScope, Ericsson, Google, Intel, Nokia, and Motorola Solutions. Beyond that, I think it's important to mention that and AT&T Mobile are all active members of the Alliance. In addition, we have Comcast, Charter, Dish, who have their own CBRS initiatives who are relevant a little bit to what we're talking about today. Again, also active members of the Alliance. And if we look at the 196, that's a lot of CBSD vendors, end devices, system integrators. So we really capture the whole ecosystem here. But I think it is important to mention that the mobile operators and the operators in general are active members of the Alliance. And this is part of what they're looking to achieve here, is bring what we're talking about today into fruition. And obviously, again, they're a little apprehensive, and they want to make sure the KPIs are all taken care of. That's why they want to. But for us, it's all a positive sign that they are active participants in this whole process. That's touch really at a high level what we do. I mean, this is a great example of neutral host. We've done the same with private networks. Those are OnGo private networks, bringing out specs, deployment guide for private networks. We have a technical working group that published specs for 5G and is advancing those. So OnGo 5G, what would that look like on the CBRS band? And just as an example of, we have a certification, which someone asked about here, certification process, which is only for CVSDs, not for end user devices. But we do certification of the small cells that deliver CBRS. And just a quick overview of the collateral that's currently in work or exists for Neutral Host. We have the deployment guide that you'll get as part of the, after this webinar, you get a link to the deployment guide to download that. We have a business guide that touches a lot of what Joel and Yusuf talked about here. It gives kind of an overview of how this would work, not necessarily from a technical side, but from the value proposition and the business models. And we also have an analyst research from Shitan Sharma coming out, which kind of talks about the opportunity in the market, which I think you've already understood here, but he really touches of what kind of an opportunity it is in the market to deploy a solution like this. So let me see if there's any more questions that I want to touch. I don't know if Joel and Yusuf, you could see something out there.
Yeah, Oren, well, just to add to what you said, something you just highlighted is desensification. That's really, really important. Remember, we talk about ecosystem partner, and the Alliance is working really hard to certify all these equipments beyond the radio device, which is really critical to the success. So now you can find that OnGo certification on this device, which gives you that certainty that this element will work when you put it, if you follow the deployment working group. And they've been putting a lot of work, certifying this device. Just to give you some analogy here, everybody's familiar with Wi-Fi, right? Well, Wi-Fi 20 years ago had dealt with the same things, not a lot of ecosystem right now. And it took them 20 years to get what you want. But right now, we're already getting a really good start because we have huge, ecosystems that are certified. And if you go to the website, you see that. And then include, I said a rich from handheld, as you saw earlier, all the way to gateway for IoT, so it's ready to put the system, to go.
Yeah, one thing on terminology, just as we've kind of threw around some terms there, for people that are not CBRS experts, CBSD, we're referring to the radio that would be put in the building. Some cases it's called a small cell, could be called an eNode B. Some people might call it an AP to reflect kind of the Wi-Fi terminology, but that's referring to that kind of radio element. And that's what the CBRS Alliance is certifying, is that entity could go and meet all those specific requirements. And then really what the OnGo Alliance has tried to do is a kind of one of its core tenets is standardized LTE or standardized 5G implementations for those networks, because what it gets you is the ability to have 3GPP standardized, so that you have band 48, which is a 3GPP band and shows up in a handset. Then it can connect to this radio that's also standardized in the same kind of way, so it can also connect to a core in a standardized kind of a way. And so the terminology wise, as you look through these papers, we're trying to make it pretty normalized on what you would be seeing as the equipment that would be impacting a venue.
Yeah, so I think we reached the top of the hour, and I just want to, first of all, say thanks to Joel and Yusuf for chiming in and giving us all this information. But also tell the people, first we're going to get back with the questions that we haven't gotten to. We'll do that, I guess, one-on-one. But also, you'll start to get these pieces of collateral, the deployment guide today, the business guide and analyst research. We have your names and emails. We know where you live, so we're going to start. We'll send that to you as well, and so look out for that in the near future. Thanks a lot, and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, cheers. Have a good day. Good job, Lauren.